On February 3rd, a train derailed in the small, quaint town of East Palestine, Ohio, which sits between Pittsburgh and Youngstown, the heart of the Rust Belt. And the train was carrying vinyl chloride. Toxic chemicals were leaking from the train tracks. They remained on the train tracks for 2 days. And in order to clear those tracks so that it can continue to make profits, the company that controlled that train, Norfolk Southern, conducted what it called a controlled ventilation. And that meant that it detonated the train and the tracks, this poison-filled train, with explosives, and created a gigantic explosion that filled the town with debris. Reporter and Grayzone contributor Jeremy Loffredo has been in East Palestine, and what he encountered is a town overrun with fear, where rivers are polluted to the point where nothing can live in them. The entire riverbed has been polluted, and it's possible that this toxic disaster can spread well beyond East Palestine. We also want to talk about, we're going to bring in Jeremy right now, and we also want to talk about the political implications, as Donald Trump, the former president, has visited East Palestine while Joe Biden was in Kiev, promising billions and billions more of U.S. tax dollars to Ukrainian warlords. So, Jeremy, welcome to the Grayzone. Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, what were your first impressions when you arrived in East Palestine? We'll play some of your interviews, but tell me what stood out to you.
Sure. When I arrived there, I mean, it seemed like a normal, rural town. It's a village, actually. They'll correct you if you call it a town. It's a village. It only has 4,000 people. Just driving around, I noticed that a lot of the stores were closed. I would say half of the stuff downtown was just closed. And there was this, thick dust in the air. There was still this white, debris flowing everywhere, which was, from after the explosion, all these burnt chemicals, they created a dust that kind of covered the town, almost like a thin layer of, a dusting of snow. And they're told that, all this dust is safe, and no one that I spoke to really believed that. And as I was still driving around, I noticed, a lot of the roads were blocked off because they're cleaning up still. And, speaking to people, nobody felt like they were being taken care of by either the federal government or the local government. They thought that the train company was, kind of running the show, and they were very skeptical. And from even before the explosion, they felt like the directions and the guidance that they were getting from the authorities was, either lacking or contradictory. They were told, you don't have to evacuate. You do have to evacuate. Everything's safe. Everything's not safe. Everything's safe. It kind of terrorized them for, it still is right now, but especially those few days. So that's what I noticed when I first got there, just this feeling of terror that everyone was experiencing.
And how extensive was the pollution and the effect on wildlife? I saw some video you shot of dead frogs in the riverbed around East Palestine.
Of course. Just driving around, it didn't seem like, anything catastrophic had happened. But then you speak to people and they say, you see this dust that's everywhere? It's not a dusty town. We don't normally have this everywhere. This is all from the explosion. And then it sort of opened my eyes to how widespread this, this pollution and this debris actually was. Since there were so many roadblocks, I decided, I'm going to go a little outside of the town and just go to a creek. And, within seconds, from 15 feet away, I could see these little white things that were on the bottom of the riverbed. And I got a little closer and I saw that it was fish and frogs and more fish and dead earthworms, and nothing was living. There was, almost a gray type of algae that covered the entire bottom of the riverbed and all of the dead things. It was just a big graveyard of wildlife. And that was, maybe 2 miles outside of town. And which is interesting because the evacuation parameter was only a mile. So this is, dead wildlife 2 miles away. Who knows, how much further that goes.
So what is the Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health, this strange group has showed up in the town to tell everyone that everything is okay.
Yeah, so you get into the town, and there's the welcome sign is being used for another purpose. The East Palestine welcome sign is actually being used to direct everyone to toxicologists, but not independent toxicologists, toxicologists that are from Norfolk Southern. And who is helping Norfolk Southern is this Center for Toxicology and Environmental Health, or CTEH. And they have a really speckled past, really controversial firm. And, they're privatizing and contracting out this work of making sure everyone's safe. But this company, according to the New York Times, I tweeted this, the New York Times spoke to a toxicologist that's familiar with the firm's work. And they said that the firm's tests are designed to meet the goals of its clients. He said, quote, "They're paid to say everything's okay." So that's who is doing the testing in the town, telling everyone that everything is going to be okay and everything's safe. Meanwhile, they see this debris in front of their face. They're told that these chemicals were toxic. They see the dead everything. I spoke to many people who have animals that were lethargic or not eating in the beginning. They found dead skunks or dead raccoons just dead on their front lawn in the middle of the day, or convulsing in their front yard. It's clear to them that everything's okay and they're being lied to. And you actually have, in 2010, Representative Lewis Capps and Representative Peter Welch. They called for BP oil giant to end their contract with CTEH,
Right.
Because they had a history of supplying insufficient data that served the, quote, corporate interests of their clients rather than protecting public health. So this is who's protecting East Palestine.
Okay, and then we have a disastrous situation where people are essentially being told everything's okay, but they know it's not. People are describing, burning lungs, the terrible smell still in the air. And here's an interview you did with the small business owner, Bob Figley, who's talking about how ruinous the destruction was and what might come next. And I think, this is highly pertinent to the wider discussion we're having today about Ukraine.
So with all of this uncertainty and all this toxicity and unknown, how do we live here? And if you want to move from here, how do you sell your property? Who's going to buy it? Would it become a ghost town at some point? There's all these questions we ask. Here's my question. Is BlackRock going to come in and buy all this? I mean, we've got a large...
Is BlackRock going to come in and buy all this? Because so many people are talking about having to leave.
Yeah, and their property values, just you have weeks and weeks of the mainstream media and the independent media and everyone likening, using East Palestine and toxic, carcinogenic, and using all these words together. And the town has essentially all of their property values. They're afraid that all of their property values have just plummeted, and the entire wealth of this town has essentially gone down the drain with this, explosion. So they're afraid that, these, financial titans are going to come in and buy everything for cheap. And, this is a place where they've lived their entire lives and they have a real sense of community. So that's something that really scares them.
And we know that that BlackRock has partnered with Vladimir Zelensky under the Advantage Ukraine austerity program to basically come in and leverage Ukraine's massive debt to take over distressed Ukrainian property, which is going to be everywhere after the war. So I thought that was an interesting connection. You've also documented the presence of private police in the town, kind of like Pinkerton style cops who appear to be controlled by Norfolk Southern and have been given jurisdiction over the entire town. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was interviewing somebody who worked at a hardware store, and he was explaining how one of the police officers identified himself as Norfolk PD. And he said, the closest Norfolk is in Virginia. And I said, well, you think it's Norfolk Southern? And he said, I think it is Norfolk Southern. So I looked it up. Norfolk Southern Police Department is a real thing. They're entirely funded by and directed by Norfolk Southern, the corporation. And, this town, which is not more than 1.5 miles wide, has about 10 unmarked SUVs filled with NSPD officers. And they have little police patches on their shirt without name identification. and they're driving all around the town. And you ask the people who are manning these public roadblocks, who's giving them direction to block these roads off, and they say, well, those black SUVs, Norfolk Southern PD. And we had a resident call the local police department and ask when the roads will be open, and they said, Norfolk Southern is in charge. Ask them. And they called the Ohio police. Said Norfolk Southern in charge. Ask them. So you have this Norfolk Southern PD, private police force, kind of overrun this town, taking jurisdiction over the local police, over the state police, closing down public roads, really ruining the people's lives in East Palestine. And they're out-of-staters. Everybody knows each other in this little town. And now you have these big black unmarked SUVs rolling around telling everyone what to do. It's not a good sight, and it's not a good story.
So essentially the private company that's responsible for this disaster that everyone blames for it, for filling the air with polyvinyl chloride, is also enforcing the aftermath through its private police force.
That's exactly what's happening. Wait, let me just add this one. I talked to a man who he took a walk in the woods. It was public land, and he was just documenting the dead fish and stuff like that. And he was taking pictures of fish. This is on the 20th, so this is 4 days ago. And he left, and while he was on his way home, he noticed that he was being followed by one of these Norfolk Southern PD. And he made a turn, he made another turn, he made another turn. This NSPD officer followed him the entire time. And when he got home, the NSPD guy rolled down his window and, clearly took his cell phone out and took pictures of this man's license plate. So these people don't feel safe, with
right.
Norfolk PD around their town. They don't know who they are. They're following them around. That's what's happening, and they're responsible for all of this.
It's shocking. And remember that, after February 3rd, this was kind of kept under wraps by national media until it kind of blew up over a week later. And especially it was the Democrats in particular who are quiet, I assume, because this is Trump country, if I'm not incorrect. So the big FU from the Democrats to the Rust Belt of Ohio. Here's Joy Behar on The View, one of our finest minds.
Regulation for a second, because it seems to me that the Republicans are obsessed with this notion of the free market, and they don't like a lot of regulations
because it means profit. When you deregulate, you get profit.
But I know
part of deregulation.
For example, there were very few plane
very
crashes.
Deep conversation.
Thank God. And that's because the industry is highly regulated. We have to pay for regulations and safety standards. Otherwise, where are we? We're all going to go up in flames.
Norfolk Southern gives as much to Democrats as Republicans. It's a very powerful lobby that is trying to block regulation. And this train, to Sarah's point, 2 miles long with 2 full-time employees and a trainee on it.
And they didn't even wipe out an entire... Because the last administration rolled it down to only one worker. They happened to have 2.
One thing I just want to say is I do think this was an unforced error by President Biden. It was 20 days before we had Secretary Buttigieg go down, 10 days before he put out a statement acknowledging it. This is Trump country. He won by 40 points. He is a president for all Americans. I believe that, but he needs to show that he is. It was time for him to be.
I don't know why they would ever vote for him. For somebody who, by the way, he placed someone with deep ties to the chemical industry in charge of the EPA's Chemical Safety Office. That's who you voted for in that district. Donald Trump, who reduces all safety. He did in those days.
Showed up at McDonald's in those votes.
Basically, she's saying they deserve what they get. I mean, it took a while to get to that. I wish the clip had been shorter, but she's basically saying you deserve what you get because you voted for Donald Trump. And it is true. I mean, Donald Trump did vote to deregulate train braking in near populated areas. I mean, he was a tool of the railroad industry, as all Republican executives have been. But she's essentially saying you deserve what you get because you voted for him there.
Of course, and that argument, it sort of misses the point. I mean, of course, deregulating the railroad industry, that's a bad idea. It's dangerous. There's derailments all the time, but it's not the derailment that caused most of this destruction and death. It was the corporate decision by the railroad company to set a bomb off in the middle of this town. And, the derailment, it's bad. It could have been solved. You could drain these cars carefully and pump these chemicals out of the cars, move the cars. It takes a while. It takes a good amount of time and effort. But the corporation just decided to line these cars with explosives and tell half of the residents, this is happening. Tell the other half you don't have to worry. Liken the toxic fire to, I believe they likened it to wood burning smoke, and they just blew it up. And they're still dealing with it a month later. It's not really. It's kind of missing the whole destructive act of setting a bomb off in the middle of this town when you talk about the derailment.
Okay. Just to recap, the train derailed, but that wasn't necessarily the issue. The issue is how the derailment was handled by the company. And that's where...
That's exactly, yeah.
So here's Pete Buttigieg. He finally arrives.
Good for him.
This is Pete Buttigieg of McKinsey. And, this is a right-wing or pro-Trump reporter, but it's a completely legitimate question to Buttigieg that he should have expected. And, I almost feel sorry for him. He got, he is the transportation secretary, but he had to take the fall because Biden wasn't going to go there. And this is not Biden country.
Mayor Pete, why did it take you an entire 2.5 weeks to actually get here to respond to East Palestine? Will you apologize to the residents of this city for the slow response? To the government's slow response, do you have any apology?
I'm a press person, I can help you.
Sure. So can we ask why it took him almost 3 weeks to get here?
I'm sorry, I don't want to do this on camera.
What was his personal time off while there was a tragedy happening here?
And can we also ask too why he waited until President Donald Trump came here to actually make an appearance? This is a very important question that people across America would like to know.
I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I do not want to be on camera.
Well,
Please put your cameras away.
I'm sorry, we're on a public area, so we are allowed as press.
You guys, I would like you guys to turn your cameras off.
You're not on my camera.
Well, I'm on a camera. I would like your cameras to be off, and then I'm happy to talk to you guys.
Well, if you're the press secretary of the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, don't you think you should be able to ask questions from the American public that you serve?
Absolutely. I would like to do it without the camera on.
Can I ask why?
I think that is a little bit aggressive. That's why.
Why is it aggressive?
That's kind of wild.
American people, I'm just asking.
And I guess you weren't there for Buttigieg, but what were people in the town saying about the Biden administration and about Joe Biden being in Ukraine to promise billions more to this completely unaccountable post-Maidan regime in Kiev while just ignoring them?
The people I spoke to, they weren't. They didn't talk much about, national electoral politics. It was very, real for them that they were going through. I mean, I'm sure they would be willing to, but that it wasn't, a priority on their mind. They just wanted to get out of this nightmare. But I will say, if you saw, there was an interview with that reporter, Savannah Hernandez, on Laura Ingraham last night, and she explained that they did end up putting their cameras away. Everyone put their camems away, and even after they put their cameras away, she wouldn't answer questions. So it's insulting to this community, and I guess they know that they're not going to get their vote either way. So you don't have to respect them.
Yeah, it just looks terrible, especially considering what Buttigieg has been doing with supply chains, flight cancellations. It's like all these airlines are just overbooking flights, then canceling people left and right. And Buttigieg is going out and saying, you do potentially have the right to go wait in line at the counter and get refunds. And I'm not fining the airlines. Like, he wouldn't go along with Bernie Sanders' proposal to brutally fine the airlines if they continue to abuse the American consumer. And then it rolls right into this. And he waits until Trump gets there. I mean, it just seems so politically boneheaded. Then he tries to wear a hard hat and winds up still looking like the McKinsey consultant who's going to lay everyone off. I mean, and there was an interview, however, with the mayor of East Palestine, Trent Conaway, where he specifically addresses the issue of Ukraine.
I think he has to prove himself to you. And Mayor, before we let you go, you saw President Joe Biden over in Ukraine. Did that make you feel slighted in any way? I mean, he hasn't really. You not hear me?
I got you, Trent. He asked, before we go, I can repeat. He said,
What's
with the
he need a
president being in
translator?
Ukraine today, did that surprise you?
Absolutely. That was the biggest slap in the face. That tells you right now he doesn't care about us. So
Agreed.
He can send every agency he wants to, but I found that out this morning in one of the briefings that he was in the Ukraine giving millions of dollars away to people over there, not to us. And I'm furious.
On President's Day in our country.
Yeah, President's Day in our country. He's over in Ukraine. So that tells you what kind of guy he is.
Well, that really seems to me how Americans feel. That was the feeling at our rally in Washington. That sense that, America comes after Ukraine. I joked on Twitter that the DNC is moving Ukraine ahead of Ohio in the presidential primary cycle for 2024, because it's obviously more important to Biden. It's certainly, Ukraine has delivered a lot more for the Biden family than Ohio. But the funny thing is that Biden campaign was brought on as Barack Obama's vice president to win over those Rust Belt whites, because he supposedly comes from Scranton, PA. He comes from the Rust Belt. He talks their language. He wears a Union jacket. He's, a straight talking guy. And then the first thing he does is he goes to like the World Economic Forum BlackRock pet project in Kiev after this disaster. And, I think they didn't even take it seriously until probably a week afterwards.
Yeah, it was a good 10, 11 days until that mushroom cloud photo, which was obviously taken the day that happened, right before that was plastered all over social media. So maybe they were looking at it and they're like, no one's really talking about it, it's fine. And then within days, for some reason, on social media, people really started paying attention to what's going on, and they made them look dumb because they hadn't been there yet, and we all saw the mushroom cloud. And we were starting to hear stories about burning lungs, dead pets, and, no one's there from the federal government.
Well, we're going to bring in Aaron Mate next. I don't know where the buzzsaw is. I don't see him in the back end, but I guess we can keep this going till I see a sign of Aaron Mate. But we're talking to Jeremy Loffredo about what's been taking place in the Ohio Oblast of the United States.
There's another, if we want to just talk about this for a second. The company that's also helping Norfolk Southern and the EPA do air and soil testing is something called Tetra Tech. And Tetra Tech, they have the same main shareholders as Norfolk Southern, BlackRock and Vanguard. And Tetra Tech is being sued right now by the Department of Justice for providing entirely fraudulent soil samples to the EPA to protect their client, which was the U.S. Navy. And it's being called, quote, the biggest case of eco-fraud in U.S. history. So you have these two private companies that have a really controversial past helping out Norfolk Southern and the EPA, telling everything it's fine. So that's just another one of the horrible private companies.
And it's just so funny. Norfolk Southern is owned by BlackRock, and so is Tetra Tech.
Yep, exactly. So
we're going to sell our publishing rights at the Grayzone to BlackRock after this. While we wait on Aaron, what was it like getting around the town? Was it difficult?
The town is extraordinarily small. There's a main street that runs along the railroad track, which cuts the town in half essentially. But it's not more than 1.5 miles by 1.5 miles. It takes 5 minutes to get from one end of the town to the other. It was funny, there's a McDonald's in town, and it's the only place with free Wi-Fi. So the McDonald's was just filled with journalists. It was just journalists who, they bought a order of fries because they wanted to use the free Wi-Fi. But that's really one of the few places to get food in the town. It's really a small village. You have to go out of town to go to the grocery store. You have to go out of town to do a bunch of things. So it's this tiny town up against this giant $55 billion corporation that has its own private police or military, however you want to put it, and their own entirely corrupt, their environmental testing companies. They really don't. They feel like they don't stand a chance, which is it looks like they don't by the looks how the federal government is handling this.
Well, and we've seen this in so many inner cities where there's been dumping sites or power companies placed in the middle of neighborhoods where people basically had no say. They had and the representatives were completely paid off. I mean, I see it down here in Southeast in Washington, D.C., where basically the developers control the mayor, and the developers are building luxury housing and displacing tons of people here. And actually, when I've seen neighbors try to fight against luxury condos being built in the middle of their street without parking, and then, you know, the parking all be zoned, and then everyone's going to lose their ability to park or get tons of tickets, and then they won't be able to pay their tickets, and then they'll have to go into debt or be moved out. You realize that the developers have actually been literally paying the Board of Zoning and Development. So the whole local government in Washington, D.C., and you see it in cities across America, completely bought off. It looks like the local government in East Palestine just doesn't even have a chance when you have private police coming in a town of 4,000. And I mean, what did they get? $25,000 total, $1,000 for each resident.
Yeah, if you were in the 1 mile evacuation zone, they gave you a $1,000 evacuation inconvenience fee, is what they called it. And then when you went to go get that $1,000 inconvenience fee, they asked for your social security card because that's going to be taxed. So, you know, these people, they got maybe $700. And the way that they evacuated was very it didn't line up well with logic. You would have people who were closer to the railroads not get evacuated, and people who were, you know, their next door neighbor across the street, they got evacuated. And you only were able to get that $700 if you were evacuated. So it's not very convenient for the people there.
I mean, is there going to be was anyone talking about any legal action?
There are, how would I put it, like, you know, kind of shark-like lawyers were, you know, in the town when I came, you know, from Texas. They weren't even from Ohio. And there was this weird thing where everyone was told to go to the high school, and everyone was told to go to the cafeteria in the high school for a pasta dinner. And no one knew who actually was organizing it. No one really knew how they found out about it. Their friend just told them to come. And before you knew it, you had a cafeteria filled with people who live in East Palestine. The lights dim, and it's a lawyer from Texas trying to get them all to go in on a lawsuit. So who knows if it was legitimate or not, but some of them definitely felt like they were about to be, you know, given a sales pitch of some sort, and be taken advantage of once again, you know, only weeks after the original disaster. So I'm sure there's going to be some types of litigation and lawsuits against the company, but, you know, the people in the town are dealing with these out-of-state lawyers, and everyone's trying to make a buck off them, and there's really nowhere to turn.
Well, it really does. Really does signal to me how people have just been completely left on their own in this country, while we're told to do everything we can to show solidarity with Ukraine and the two countries we live in. And what the Biden administration has done is they've completely teed up the message of Donald Trump's 2024 campaign.